Hey everybody, welcome to week 2 quarantine.
Quarantine week 2.
Quarantine week 2. Goodness gracious, man, everything is so different, and preaching to an empty room is crazy feeling. But how did it make you feel whenever you saw the number of people who were engaged in watching online during the course of last Sunday's message?
That part of it is super cool. You know, I think we just we recognize that we've got a lot of people that are tuning in that are a long way off, or that are, you know, kin to people, family members. And, you know, and I think we've talked about this, obviously, but it is a great opportunity for the church.
Yeah,
it's a great opportunity for the church to reach new people. And so,
a lot of really cool stories. One of our founding members, Jerry Manley, he posted on my stream. He said, "Hey, this is the first time since I was a little boy that I was actually able to worship with my brother."
Oh, wow.
And so he and Clay were both watching at the same time. And
that's very cool. Just
tons of stories like that. But yeah, things are different. Times are different.
Yeah.
What's it like quarantined in the McDill household? What's going on there?
Well, I am ready for the quarantine to be over. and I don't think it's happening soon. But, you know, we've been playing a lot of games.
Yeah, you mentioned that in your sermon.
Yeah. So, I did. We have discovered a game, Settlers of Catan. You ever played
I've heard of it. I know.
Well,
it seems too smart.
I always thought it was kind of a nerd game, but and it may be. But it's kind of a strategy.
It looked too complicated to me.
Monopoly on steroids.
Yeah, we're pretty much a Uno Skip-Bo kind of family.
Yeah.
So we went.
What about the way?
Yeah, we went to New Mexico and to visit my mother-in-law.
Flowers hadn't made it out there.
Not a whole lot, but you know me, I'm a germaphobe, so we took a lot.
We were making jokes around here that you had actually just gone into the wilderness to get away from.
I kind of did. Yeah.
Anybody that
I was on the side of a mountain in New Mexico.
There you go.
But yeah, it was everything is just different. But you know, we're not overly stir crazy. We're homebodies, generally speaking. So it's so far not a huge shift for my family. Except for the being out of school and us suddenly becoming teachers. And I just want to let all the teachers know how much I appreciate all that you do, because I'm not a good teacher.
How's that going?
I don't know. I gave up. I've already quit.
This is day one for Kaufman, right?
Yeah, and I've turned in my resignation.
This is day one for just about everybody, I think. So.
Turned in my resignation of being a homeschool teacher at about 9:05 this morning, because we started about 9 o'clock. Yeah. And pass that baton to my wife. So
I'm not really a teacher. I'm more of a superintendent.
There you go. There you
go. But so far, our kids are in school suspension, I think, already.
Yeah.
We got all kinds of. We're not really learning a lot at the McDill household, honestly.
Well, we'll see how it all plays out. But man, yesterday the message was really, really good, and I mean that sincerely. I think that, you know, so many people, we know when we do a message on anxiety or worry or any of those kinds of topics, we get so much feedback.
Right.
And so at this point, we know that all of our worriers are probably pretty stressed out. And all our people that battle anxiety, it's probably kind of at a tipping point for them. And so I thought the message yesterday of one that was just full of hope and vision and trust and knowing how, you know, that we can move forward in confidence because we know it's not over, you know, that God's still in control. Just such a great reminder. You gave us 5 things. What were those 5 things? What were those 5 things?
You know, so the 5 things are, I hope I can remember these, because if I can't remember these, not much chance anybody else is, right? The 5 things are help, worship, hope, trust, and victory.
Yeah.
Those are the 5 kind of key words.
Yeah. So why do you think, in terms of help, and you mentioned this some in your message, but as people are watching this, why do you think in times of, you know, uncertainty or whatever, that we have a tendency to not necessarily depend on God to help us, but we become maybe a little bit more self-sufficient, say, no, I can do this, I can be smart, I can stockpile this, I can do that, I can manage this and whatever else. Why, in your opinion, if you even agree with this assessment, just sometimes we have to get to the very end of ourselves before we're willing to ask for help, versus seeing on the front end, hey, God is available to help and we need to lean on Him. Why do we tend to make that the last resort?
Well, I think there's this little thing in all of us called pride.
Yeah.
You know, that there is something in all of us that thinks we're better than what we really are, that we're more capable than what we really are, that we're smarter than what we really are, than, you know, that we're better than what we really are. And normally, I think we really hold on to that until we get to the end until we get to the point where we recognize, listen, you know, I used the illustration of a kid being thrown in the, or, you know, finding themselves in deep water, water that they couldn't get out of, water that was too deep for them to swim in.
Yeah.
And at that point, they cry out for help. You know, and when we get to that place where we're about to go under for good and we recognize, I can't help myself here, I think that's the point where we're willing to cry out for help. But until then, we're like, oh, I'll figure this out.
Yeah.
I'll get myself up here.
So maybe a thing people could talk about virtually, you know, through their groups, would just be, maybe there's an area of your life where you have been prideful and you've not been willing to reach out for help. Maybe it's asking God for help or asking the people of God for help. You know, it could be that there's a need that you have that you haven't ever vocalized to your group. Maybe this would be a good chance to do that. And if you start feeling uncomfortable, you can just exit the meeting, right? I mean, no,
absolutely.
I'm joking.
I don't know what happened.
I don't know what happened. Internet, you know.
Yeah.
So help, and then
worship.
You mentioned worship. Talk a little bit about worship, because I think a lot of times whenever we use that word, people automatically just go to music. Yeah, right. But it's deeper than that.
Yeah.
There's a lot more to it. What is worship?
I think worship is just when you give God His worth. That, you know, originally that word comes from the phrase worthship, W-O-R-T-H, and it means to give God His worth. And you can do that in lots of different ways. And we normally think of it as singing a song of worship, and that's certainly a great way to do it. And all of us have something inside of us that's moved by music. But there are other ways to worship God. You can worship God just by saying something. Like if you right now decided you wanted to worship God for His goodness, you could say, God, I just worship you for your good.
Right.
And that's giving God for being good, that's giving God His worth. And, I think, for me, I do that in all sorts of ways. I love to sing and grab a hold of a worship song, and oftentimes in my car, I'm pretending to be somebody that I'm not singing one of those songs. But I also like to just, sometimes in prayer, there's worship going on. Or in my journal, I'll normally pick one characteristic of God that I see revealed in Scripture and just write about that, right? God, and I just praise you today for being faithful. And talk about His faithfulness, And
there's something about, I think, that when we are intentional about assigning to God His worth and remembering, then that, clearly that then elevates Him in our own spirit to where suddenly the things that bothered us or that are causing us anxiety or worry or frustration or anger or bitterness or whatever, they diminish, because that's something you said yesterday. When we assign worth to, or we worship, that I think you said whatever it is we worship expands.
Yeah, right.
So
well, and Randy, the thing about it is, we don't need to see, we don't need to make God bigger. And so we don't need to make God bigger. And sometimes we use the term, and I'm not really super opposed to this, but even in worship music, we'll say magnify God. And I've never felt like that was really accurate, because to magnify something means you take something that's really small, and when you magnify it, you make it look bigger than what it is. And we don't need to do that with God, because He's really plenty big on His own.
That's a good point.
But we need to see how big He is. Yeah. And when you worship Him, you just begin to focus on, man, God's really big. He's really, when I'm focused on His power and I'm saying that to Him, God, I praise you for being so powerful, or being so in control, or you're sovereign and all that. It helps me to see how big He really is. And when I see Him accurately, that's all I need to do, is see Him accurately. Yeah. Then everything else gets really small compared to Him.
Sure, yeah, and I think our individual worship, it kind of leaks out on other people. So maybe that's something that you could do in your group as well, is just everybody kind of take turns and give an attribute of God or a scripture that reminds you of the glory of God, or the bigness of God, or the strength of God, or the mercy of God, and just speak that out loud to not only remind yourself, but whenever you do that, there's a good chance that the Spirit is going to use that to edify another believer in the group who needs to be reminded of that
That's
truth.
That's a great idea.
So I know we don't have time to go through all 5 things, but what was one of the passages that you shared with us in the message on Sunday that just resonates most deeply with you?
Well, let me, I guess my favorite part of the main passage that I taught from, if I could do that, I love that verse 7 that says, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. that it just makes it so clear that really it just assumes that everybody's going to trust in something. Some are trusting in horses, some are trusting in chariots. You know, he doesn't even say in there, you know, somebody's going to trust in nothing, because we all are trusting in something. And most of us like to put our trust in things that we can grab a hold of or things that we can see. But for believers, our trust is in the name of the Lord our God. And even when he says that, you know, that the name of the Lord our God and the name of God are those attributes. They're the things that make him up, you know, that tell us about his character. And so we're trusting in who God is. That's what David's saying there, that our trust is in who God is.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and so that's probably my favorite verse in that whole passage.
Yeah, and it's such a timely message, because right now we're all tempted to put our trust in the CDC guidelines, or to put our trust in the latest health craze that's out there, or to put our trust in the quarantine, or to put our trust in, you know, whatever. But at the end of the day, as believers, our testimony really needs to be, hey, we don't mind listening to the counsel of these people, and we'll do what we believe is the wise thing to do. Or what. But at the end of the day, our confidence eternally is in God.
Yeah.
And
well, you know, and even a while ago, you mentioned, you know, for people, you said for people with anxiety or people with worry, you know, this is a really difficult time. And the thing that I would say about that is, I think this is a really difficult time for people without anxiety, and for people without any sense of worry. I've never been a big worrier, but this thing has me a little going, oh, how is this going to work out? And you know this, I mean, we're all reminding each other, hey, we've got to just keep in mind that this is God's deal, and God's in charge, and I'm saying, I'm preaching that to myself all the time, that hey, at the end of the day, God's in control here, and we really believe that, you know. And I love the way that ends, and it says, you know, that was the last word was victory. It says, they collapse and fall, but we rise and stand upright. That those of us that put our trust in the name of the Lord our God, we're going to stand tall at the end of this thing. Yeah.
So last little bit of encouragement, and I know the answer to this, but I think it'd be good for our groups to hear this. How do you think all this ends? Like, when, not how do you think it ends? When this crisis is over, is the church going to be stronger, or is she going to be weaker?
Man, I am so sure of this truth. I am so sure of this, that the church is going to be stronger than the church has ever been. It's always been the case throughout history, through church history. When there was difficulty, when there was struggle, man, the church has always risen to the occasion and shined in that. And I think right now we're seeing that happen, that the church is shining. You know, that the church is meeting people's needs. That was the way it was in plagues, you know, thousands of years ago, when there were plagues and everybody else people were being thrown out on the street. It was the Christians that came forward and took care of people, and that's really what propelled the church out of the first century. The church should have never made it out of the first century, but because of the way that they cared about people and they shined in that time, the church made it out of that. And man, you know, I know you're the same way, but I love the church.
And I think so. The last little thing, and I don't expect everybody to go out and buy church history books, but it's fascinating really to read church history and just to see how God has always strengthened the church during times of persecution and crisis. And as the church responds to that, the world that is panic-stricken and not really sure where to go, they get to see that as believers, we cry out to our God for help. He gives us hope. He brings us victory. You know, all these things that you mentioned. And so that's why it's so important that we place our faith in God.
And maybe it's no coincidence that the origin of the virus, where the virus started in China, where it started, should be a reminder to us of this, because for years and years and years in China, where they're not allowed to meet together like we do like we used to do on Sundays, where and the church has just been kicking tail and growing faster there than just about anywhere in the world. And so, you know, the reality is God doesn't need a building. And the church
the church is going to do fine, and we're the church. And so let that be an encouragement to you. We appreciate you joining us. Hope that your group is productive as you talk through these things.